William Thompson had always been an early riser. At 78 years old, his internal clock still operated on military time, waking him at precisely 5:30 each morning. His small flat in East London was modest but impeccably maintained, every corner reflecting the discipline that had shaped his life for over half a century. The walls were decorated with photographs from his 32 years of service in the British Army, each image telling a story of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to his country. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, William had a special purpose for his early start. Today marked the anniversary of his late wife Margaret's passing, and he had made a promise to visit the memorial gardens near Buckingham Palace where they had shared their first kiss 55 years earlier. Margaret had been gone for 3 years now, but William still felt her presence strongest in the places they had shared their happiest memories. As he carefully pressed his service medals onto his jacket, William's weathered hands trembled slightly. Age had taken its toll on the man who had once stood straight as an arrow during countless military parades. His back was bent from years of carrying heavy equipment across foreign battlefields, and his left leg bore the permanent reminder of shrapnel from a mission in Northern Ireland that had earned him a commendation for bravery. Despite these physical challenges, his eyes still held the sharp intelligence and quiet dignity that had made him a respected leader among his fellow soldiers. The journey from his flat to central London was one William made several times a year, always using public transport despite his son's offers to drive him. He believed in maintaining his independence, viewing each solo expedition as a small victory against the limitations of age. The underground was busier than usual that morning, filled with commuters rushing to their offices and tourists eager to explore the capital's landmarks. William found a seat near the window and watched the familiar stations pass by, his mind drifting to memories of Margaret and their life together. Margaret had been a nurse during the early years of their marriage, working long shifts at the local hospital while William was deployed overseas. She had written him letters every single day, filling pages with news from home, descriptions of her patients, and words of encouragement that had sustained him through his darkest moments. He still kept every letter she had ever written him, carefully preserved in a wooden box beside his bed. When he retired from the army, they had enjoyed 20 wonderful years together, traveling to places they had only dreamed of visiting during their younger, busier years. The train pulled into Westminster Station, and William carefully made his way through the crowds. His walking stick tapped rhythmically against the platform as he navigated toward the exit. Several fellow passengers noticed his medals and offered respectful nods, which William acknowledged with a small smile. He had never been one to seek attention for his service, but he appreciated the recognition from those who understood what the decorations represented. The walk from the station to the palace grounds took longer than it used to, but William didn't mind the slower pace. It gave him time to observe the city he had spent his life protecting. London had changed dramatically since his childhood, but certain landmarks remained constant, providing comfort in their permanence. The sight of Big Ben in the distance brought back memories of returning from deployments, the iconic clock tower serving as a beacon that meant he was truly home. As he approached the palace area, William noticed the usual gathering of tourists, street performers, and vendors selling souvenirs. The royal guards stood at their posts with characteristic stoicism, their red tunics and bearskin hats drawing constant attention from visitors eager to capture photographs. William had always felt a kinship with these soldiers, understanding the discipline required to maintain such perfect composure despite the chaos surrounding them. The memorial gardens were quieter than the main tourist areas, tucked away behind ornate iron gates that many visitors overlooked in their rush to see the palace itself. William had discovered this peaceful spot during one of his early visits to London with Margaret, and they had returned here many times over the years. The gardens contained monuments to various military campaigns and fallen soldiers, creating a sacred space where reflection and remembrance felt natural and appropriate. William found his favorite bench beneath an ancient oak tree and slowly lowered himself onto the worn wooden slats. From this position, he had a clear view of both the memorial wall and the palace guards in the distance. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small photograph of Margaret, taken during their honeymoon in Scotland. Her smile was radiant in the picture, captured during a moment of pure joy that had defined their entire relationship. For nearly an hour, William sat quietly, sometimes speaking softly to Margaret's photograph, sharing updates about their children and grandchildren. He told her about their youngest grandson's recent acceptance to university and their daughter's promotion at work. These conversations had become a cherished ritual, helping him feel connected to the woman who had been his anchor for more than 50 years. The peaceful atmosphere was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices, young men speaking loudly and aggressively about various topics that would have made Margaret blush. William glanced up to see three teenagers, probably around 19 or 20 years old, walking directly toward his section of the gardens. They wore expensive athletic clothing and carried themselves with the confidence that often comes from never having faced real consequences for their actions. The leader of the group was tall and muscular, with elaborate tattoos covering his arms and neck. His companions seemed to look to him for direction, laughing too loudly at his crude jokes and mimicking his swagger as they moved through the gardens. They appeared to be under the influence of something, their movements slightly unsteady and their voices carrying farther than they realized. William hoped they would simply pass by, but his military instincts told him trouble was approaching. He had learned to recognize predatory behavior during his years of service, and these young men displayed all the warning signs of individuals looking for someone to victimize. Their eyes scanned the area constantly, searching for targets of opportunity, and their body language suggested they were working up the courage for some kind of confrontation. As they drew closer, William could hear fragments of their conversation. They were complaining about various aspects of their lives, blaming society, the government, and older generations for their problems. Their words revealed a deep sense of entitlement and anger that seemed to be seeking an outlet. When they noticed William sitting alone on the bench, their attention focused on him with predatory intensity. The leader whispered something to his companions that made them all grin maliciously. William recognized the look immediately. He had seen it on the faces of enemies during his military service, the expression of people who had chosen to embrace cruelty as entertainment. His grip tightened on his walking stick as he prepared for whatever was coming next. William's military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and accurately. These young men outnumbered him 3-1, were decades younger, and appeared to be under the influence of substances that might make them unpredictable and dangerous. His options were limited by his age and physical condition, but his mind remained sharp and tactical. He quickly calculated distances to potential escape routes and identified objects in the area that could serve as defensive tools if necessary. The teenagers had now stopped pretending to ignore him and were approaching directly. Their leader was pointing in William's direction and making comments that caused his followers to laugh with anticipation. William straightened his shoulders as much as his aged spine would allow and prepared to face whatever challenge these young men intended to present. Despite the approaching danger, William felt no fear. He had faced far more serious threats during his military career, and his primary concern was protecting Margaret's photograph and maintaining his dignity regardless of what transpired. If these young men thought they had found an easy target in an elderly veteran, they were about to receive an education in the difference between age and weakness. The peaceful morning at the Memorial Gardens was about to transform into something none of the participants could have anticipated, setting in motion events that would resonate far beyond this quiet corner of London. The three young men approached William's bench with the casual arrogance of predators who had never encountered meaningful resistance. Their leader, who had introduced himself to his companions earlier as Danny, stood nearly 6 feet tall and carried himself with the aggressive confidence that came from a lifetime of using intimidation to get his way. His two followers, Mark and Tyler, were slightly smaller but no less menacing in their approach, feeding off their leader's energy and eager to prove their loyalty through participation in whatever cruelty he had planned. Danny stopped directly in front of William's bench, deliberately blocking the elderly veteran's view of the memorial wall. His presence was aggressive and invasive, calculated to make William feel trapped and vulnerable. The strong smell of alcohol and marijuana surrounded him like a toxic cloud, evidence of a morning spent indulging in substances that had clearly impaired his judgment and lowered his inhibitions even further. "Look what we have here," Danny announced loudly, his voice carrying a mocking tone that immediately drew the attention of other visitors in the nearby area. "Some old fool playing dress-up with his little costume jewelry." He gestured dismissively at William's service medals, treating the decorations that represented decades of sacrifice and service as nothing more than cheap trinkets worthy of ridicule. William remained seated, his posture straight and dignified despite the obvious threat developing around him. His years of military training had taught him that responding to initial provocations often escalated situations unnecessarily, and his experience dealing with hostile encounters had shown him the value of maintaining composure under pressure. He continued to hold Margaret's photograph gently in his hands, treating it as an anchor that connected him to everything he considered worth protecting. Mark and Tyler positioned themselves on either side of William's bench, effectively surrounding the elderly man and cutting off his most obvious escape routes. Their movements were coordinated and deliberate, suggesting they had engaged in similar intimidation tactics before. The positioning also served to shield their leader's actions from casual observation by other people in the gardens, creating a pocket of isolation where they could operate without immediate interference. "You deaf, old man?" Danny continued when William failed to respond to his initial insult. "I'm talking to you. What are you supposed to be, some kind of war hero?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick and deliberately offensive, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify escalating their harassment to physical violence. His followers chuckled appreciatively at their leader's crude humor, encouraging him to continue his performance. William finally looked up at his tormentors, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond mild curiosity. His pale blue eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the steady gaze that had once commanded respect from soldiers under his leadership. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced genuine danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "I'm simply visiting a memorial to remember my wife," William said quietly. "I have no interest in any conflict with you young men. Perhaps you might find entertainment elsewhere and allow me to continue my private remembrance in peace." His words were polite but firm, offering them an opportunity to withdraw without losing face while making it clear he would not be intimidated into leaving. Danny's reaction to William's reasonable response was immediate and violent. He interpreted the elderly man's composed demeanor as disrespect and his polite refusal to be intimidated as a challenge to his authority. Without warning, he reached down and snatched Margaret's photograph from William's hands, holding it up to examine it with exaggerated interest while his companions watched eagerly for their leader's next move. "Look at this old bag," Danny announced, waving the photograph in the air where William could see it but not reach it. "Is this your dead wife, old man? She looks like she was probably ugly even when she was young. I bet she was glad to die just to get away from looking at your ugly face every day." His words were calculated to cause maximum emotional pain, attacking the most sacred aspect of William's life with deliberate cruelty. The change in William's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His hands clenched slightly around his walking stick, and his jaw tightened with controlled anger. However, he remained seated and continued to speak in the same measured tone, though his words now carried an edge of steel that hadn't been present before. His military training had taught him that emotional responses were often exactly what bullies hoped to provoke, and he refused to give these young men the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "Please return my wife's photograph," William said, his voice remaining steady despite the profound insult to Margaret's memory. She was a good woman who deserved better than to have her image handled by someone who lacks basic human decency. "I'm asking you politely to give it back and leave me alone." His request was reasonable and dignified, but Danny's reaction suggested that reason and dignity were foreign concepts to him. Instead of returning the photograph, Danny held it higher and made crude gestures toward it, pretending to interact with Margaret's image in ways that were both disgusting and deeply offensive. His followers laughed enthusiastically at their leader's performance, encouraging him to continue and escalate his behavior. The few other visitors in the area had begun to notice the disturbance, but most were maintaining their distance, uncertain whether they should intervene in what appeared to be a developing confrontation. "Maybe I'll keep this as a souvenir," Danny announced, making a show of examining the photograph more closely. "Your dead wife can come home with me and see how a real man lives. I bet she never had a good time until she finally croaked and got away from a pathetic old soldier like you." His words crossed every line of basic human decency, attacking not only Margaret's memory but also William's service and sacrifice for his country. William slowly began to rise from the bench, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the obvious difficulty his aged body had with the action. His walking stick provided necessary support as he struggled to his feet, but his eyes never left Danny's face. The young man seemed to interpret William's slow movements as evidence of weakness and continued his verbal assault, unaware that he was making one of the most dangerous mistakes of his life. "That's right, old man, stand up so I can knock you back down," Danny taunted, clearly expecting his threat to intimidate William into submission. "Maybe after I'm done with you, I'll visit your wife's grave and tell her what a coward her husband turned out to be. I'm sure she's rolling over in her dirt bed knowing what a pathetic excuse for a man she married." The words hit their target with devastating effect, but not in the way Danny had anticipated. Instead of breaking William's spirit, the attack on Margaret's memory seemed to strengthen his resolve and focus his attention with laser intensity. His military training had prepared him for many challenges, but nothing had taught him to tolerate attacks on the memory of the woman who had been his life's greatest blessing. Other visitors in the memorial gardens had begun to take notice of the escalating confrontation, though most remained at a safe distance, uncertain whether they should intervene or seek help. A few people had begun taking out their phones, either to record the incident or to call for assistance, but the situation was developing too quickly for outside intervention to prevent whatever was about to happen. The royal guards stationed at their posts near the palace entrance were still too far away to observe the details of what was occurring in the memorial gardens, though the raised voices had begun to carry in their direction. Their training required them to maintain their posts unless specifically ordered to intervene, but several had begun to notice the disturbance and were tracking its development with professional interest. Danny, emboldened by what he perceived as William's helplessness and the lack of immediate intervention by other adults in the area, decided to escalate his harassment to physical violence. He stepped closer to William, invading his personal space with aggressive intent, while his followers moved into supporting positions around the elderly veteran. The photograph of Margaret remained in Danny's hand like a trophy, a symbol of his power over someone he perceived as weak and defenseless. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" Danny challenged, his face now inches from William's. "You going to cry? You going to call for help? There's nobody here who cares about some old fool and his dead wife. You're all alone, just like she probably was when she finally gave up and died to escape being married to a loser like you." William's response was so quiet that Danny had to strain to hear it, but the words carried a weight and certainty that should have served as a warning to anyone with the wisdom to recognize it. His voice remained calm and controlled, but underneath the surface politeness was something that military veterans would have immediately recognized as extremely dangerous. "Young man," William said quietly, "you have made several serious mistakes this morning. The first was choosing to harass an elderly person who simply wanted to remember his wife in peace. The second was insulting the memory of a woman who was worth 100 of you. But your third mistake was the most serious one." He paused, his eyes meeting Danny's with unwavering intensity. "You assumed that age equals helplessness." The words were spoken so calmly that Danny initially missed their significance, but something in William's tone caused him to hesitate for the first time since the confrontation began. His followers also seemed to sense a change in the atmosphere, though they couldn't identify exactly what had shifted in the elderly man's demeanor. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as both shocking and inevitable. William Thompson, despite his 78 years and physical limitations, had not forgotten the combat training that had been drilled into him during 3 decades of military service. More importantly, he had not lost the protective instincts that had made him an effective soldier and a devoted husband. When Danny reached out to shove him backwards, expecting the elderly man to fall helplessly to the ground, he encountered resistance that defied every assumption he had made about his victim. William's walking stick, which Danny had dismissed as a sign of weakness, became a weapon in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. With a speed that surprised everyone present, William twisted the stick upward, catching Danny under the chin with enough force to snap his head back and cause him to stagger backward several steps. The photograph of Margaret fluttered to the ground as Danny's hands instinctively moved to his throat, his eyes wide with shock and sudden pain. The transformation in William was immediate and complete. The frail elderly man had been replaced by something much more dangerous, someone whose muscle memory still retained the skills that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. His posture straightened as much as his aged spine would allow, and his eyes took on the focused intensity of a predator who had been underestimated by his prey. Mark and Tyler, who had been expecting to enjoy watching their leader humiliate a helpless old man, found themselves facing a situation they had not anticipated and were not prepared to handle. Their experience with violence was limited to picking on people who couldn't fight back, and they had never encountered someone who remained calm and tactical under pressure. The sudden reversal of their assumed superiority left them confused and uncertain about how to proceed. Danny, recovering from the unexpected blow to his throat, was now genuinely angry rather than merely entertained. His pride had been wounded in front of his followers, and he felt compelled to reassert his dominance through increased violence. However, his approach to William became more cautious and respectful, recognizing that his initial assessment of the elderly man had been dangerously wrong. "You're going to pay for that, old man," Danny growled, his voice hoarse from the impact to his throat. "Nobody puts their hands on me," and walks away. Despite his brave words, he kept his distance from William's walking stick, having learned to respect the weapon he had previously ignored. His followers spread out to flank the elderly veteran, but their movements lacked the casual confidence they had displayed earlier. William bent slowly to retrieve Margaret's photograph from where it had fallen, his eyes never leaving the three young men who surrounded him. His movements were deliberate and controlled, showing no fear of turning his back on his opponents or taking his attention away from them momentarily. The photograph had suffered a small tear along one edge, and William's jaw tightened as he carefully smoothed the damaged image with his thumb. "You've damaged my wife's photograph," William observed quietly, his voice carrying the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the confrontation. "That was unwise." He carefully placed the photograph in his jacket pocket, ensuring it was secure before returning his full attention to the three young men. "I had hoped we could resolve this situation peacefully, but you seem determined to learn your lessons the hard way." The sound of approaching footsteps caught everyone's attention as other visitors to the Memorial Gardens had finally overcome their initial reluctance to become involved. Several middle-aged men were walking purposefully toward the confrontation, their body language suggesting they were prepared to intervene on William's behalf. However, they were still too far away to provide immediate assistance, and Danny seemed determined to settle the matter before outside help could arrive. What none of the participants in the developing fight had noticed was that their raised voices and aggressive movements had finally attracted the attention of the royal guards stationed near the palace entrance. Two guards had broken from their ceremonial positions and were moving quietly through the gardens, approaching the scene with professional stealth that kept them hidden from the combatants until they chose to reveal themselves. Danny made his decision to attack with the reckless courage of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. He rushed forward, intending to tackle William to the ground where his size and youth would provide overwhelming advantages. His plan was simple and brutal: knock the old man down, then kick him until he begged for mercy while his followers held off any potential rescuers. William's response demonstrated why he had survived 32 years of military service in some of the world's most dangerous locations. Instead of trying to stand his ground against a much larger and stronger opponent, he used Danny's momentum against him. As the young man charged forward, William stepped aside with surprising agility for his age and extended his walking stick at ankle height. Danny, unable to stop his forward motion, tripped spectacularly and crashed face-first into the memorial wall with a sickening impact that echoed across the gardens. The collision left Danny stunned and bleeding, his nose clearly broken and several teeth loosened from the impact. He slumped against the wall, temporarily incapacitated and no longer an immediate threat. His followers stared in shock at their fallen leader, unable to process how their coordinated attack on a helpless elderly man had gone so wrong so quickly. Mark, the larger of Danny's two companions, decided to avenge his friend's humiliation. He approached William with more caution than Danny had shown, but his anger overcame his prudence. He swung a wild punch aimed at William's head, expecting to end the fight with a single devastating blow that would restore their group's dominance. William's military training had included extensive hand-to-hand combat instruction, skills that had been refined through actual combat experience rather than just theoretical practice. He ducked under Mark's clumsy swing and drove the handle of his walking stick into the young man's solar plexus with surgical precision. Mark doubled over, gasping for air and temporarily paralyzed by the perfectly placed strike. Tyler, the smallest and youngest of the three attackers, realized that the situation had deteriorated beyond anything they had prepared for. His two companions were down, an elderly man they had intended to victimize was standing over them like an avenging angel, and other adults were approaching rapidly to provide assistance. His fight-or-flight instincts chose flight, and he turned to run before the situation could get any worse. However, Tyler's escape route was blocked by the arrival of the two royal guards who had been quietly approaching the scene. These soldiers, trained to the highest standards and equipped with authority to maintain order in the palace grounds, stepped into view with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention and respect. Their red uniforms and ceremonial weapons seemed almost theatrical, but their bearing and professionalism left no doubt about their capability to handle any situation that might arise. "Gentlemen," one of the guards announced in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I believe this disturbance has continued long enough. Everyone will remain exactly where they are while we sort out what has occurred here." His companion moved to secure Tyler, who was now trapped between the guards and William, while the first guard surveyed the scene to assess the situation. William immediately straightened to attention, recognizing the authority of the royal guards and responding with the automatic respect that his military background demanded. Despite his recent exertion and the adrenaline still coursing through his system, he maintained his composure and prepared to provide a clear and accurate account of the events that had led to the confrontation. "Sir," William addressed the guard with proper military courtesy, "these three young men approached me while I was visiting this memorial to remember my deceased wife. They became abusive, damaged her photograph, and initiated physical violence when I requested that they leave me in peace. I defended myself using minimal necessary force and am prepared to provide a full statement regarding the incident." The guard's expression softened slightly as he took in William's military bearing, service medals, and obvious status as a veteran. His assessment of the scene supported William's account, one elderly man with a walking stick facing three much younger opponents who were now in various states of defeat and distress. The evidence of who had been the aggressor and who had been defending himself was clear and unambiguous. Danny was beginning to recover from his collision with the memorial wall, though his face was a mess of blood and his movements remained unsteady. Mark was still struggling to catch his breath from the precise strike to his solar plexus, while Tyler stood frozen between the guards and William, clearly wishing he had chosen better companions for his morning's entertainment. "You three," the guard addressed the young men with crisp authority, "will remain silent until you are specifically asked to speak. Any attempt to leave this area before this matter is resolved will result in your immediate arrest." His tone left no room for argument or negotiation, and all three attackers nodded their understanding despite their various injuries and discomforts. The approaching civilians had now arrived at the scene, several offering to serve as witnesses to what they had observed. Their accounts confirmed William's version of events. They had seen the three young men harassing the elderly veteran, damaging his photograph, and initiating physical violence before being decisively defeated by someone they had badly underestimated. William remained standing at attention, his walking stick at his side and his dignity intact despite the violence he had been forced to engage in. The morning that had begun as a quiet memorial visit to honor his wife's memory had transformed into something much more significant, though he couldn't yet realize how far the consequences would extend beyond this peaceful corner of London. Within minutes of the Royal Guard's arrival, the Memorial Gardens had transformed from a quiet place of reflection into the center of a carefully orchestrated response that demonstrated the full weight of British military and legal authority. The guards had immediately radioed for backup and medical assistance, setting in motion a chain of events that would ensure the incident was handled with the thoroughness and gravity it deserved. Additional Royal Guards arrived first, followed closely by Metropolitan Police officers who had been stationed nearby as part of the palace security detail. The officers were experienced in handling situations involving threats to public order, but the sight of an elderly veteran standing calmly over three defeated attackers was unusual even by their standards. Their assessment of the scene confirmed what the Royal Guards had already determined. This was a clear case of justified self-defense by someone who deserved their protection and respect. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was among the first senior officers to arrive at the scene. With 15 years of experience investigating violent crimes in London, she had developed an eye for distinguishing between genuine victims and people who created their own problems. Her initial observation of William Thompson, standing at respectful attention despite having just defended himself against three attackers, immediately placed him in the former category. "Sir," Detective Inspector Collins addressed William with professional courtesy, "I'm D.I. Collins with the Metropolitan Police. Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Her concern was genuine, recognizing that elderly people often suffered delayed reactions to physical confrontations even when they appeared unharmed immediately afterward. William shook his head politely but remained standing at attention, waiting for permission to speak freely. His military training had taught him to respect the chain of command and proper procedures, especially when dealing with law enforcement officers who were conducting an official investigation. The detective inspector recognized his military bearing and adjusted her approach accordingly. "Please, sit down and tell me what happened here," D.I. Collins continued, gesturing toward William's bench. "Take your time and provide as much detail as you can remember. We want to ensure we have a complete understanding of the events before we proceed with any charges." Her tone was supportive and encouraging, clearly indicating that William was being treated as the victim rather than a suspect. As William recounted the events leading up to the confrontation, several witnesses came forward to provide corroborating testimony. A retired teacher named Mrs. Henderson had observed the entire incident from a nearby bench and was eager to provide a statement supporting William's account. A young couple who had been visiting the memorial had recorded part of the confrontation on their phone, capturing clear evidence of the three attackers' aggressive behavior and William's restrained response. The medical personnel who arrived to assess the injuries found Danny suffering from a broken nose, several loosened teeth, and a mild concussion from his impact with the memorial wall. Mark had bruised ribs and was still experiencing difficulty breathing from the precise strike to his solar plexus. Tyler's only injury was to his pride, having been captured before he could escape the consequences of his poor choice in companions. As the medical team treated the three attackers, their true characters became increasingly evident to the assembled law enforcement officers. Danny complained loudly about his injuries while simultaneously threatening to sue everyone present, demonstrating a complete lack of accountability for his role in creating the situation. Mark demanded to know why he was being treated like a criminal when he claimed to be the victim of an unprovoked assault. Tyler attempted to distance himself from his companions, claiming he had been an unwilling participant in their harassment of William. D.I. Collins' investigation quickly revealed that all three young men had extensive criminal records involving assault, public disorder, and harassment of vulnerable individuals. Danny had been convicted twice for attacking elderly people, receiving suspended sentences that had apparently taught him nothing about the consequences of his behavior. Mark had a history of alcohol-related violence, while Tyler had been repeatedly arrested for participating in group attacks on people who couldn't defend themselves. The contrast between the attackers' criminal backgrounds and William's distinguished service record was stark and telling. Military records confirmed that William Thompson had served with distinction in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, receiving commendations for bravery and leadership throughout his career. His commanding officers had consistently praised his character, professionalism, and dedication to protecting others, qualities that had clearly remained with him long after his retirement from active service. Word of the incident was spreading rapidly through the law enforcement community, drawing attention from senior officials who recognized the significance of what had occurred. Commander James Harrison, responsible for Royal Protection and Security, arrived to personally oversee the investigation and ensure that the veteran who had been attacked received appropriate support and recognition. "Mr. Thompson," Commander Harrison addressed William with the respect due to a fellow military professional, "I want you to know that this incident will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. These individuals chose to assault a decorated veteran at a war memorial, which represents an attack on everything our military stands for. They will face consequences that reflect the seriousness of their crimes." The legal implications of the case were becoming clear to everyone involved except the three attackers, who seemed unable to grasp the gravity of their situation. Under British law, attacking someone at a war memorial carried enhanced penalties, particularly when the victim was a military veteran. The presence of the Royal Guards as witnesses added another layer of official gravity to the proceedings, ensuring that the case would receive priority attention from prosecutors. As the afternoon progressed, additional evidence emerged that painted an even clearer picture of the three attackers' culpability. Security cameras from nearby buildings had captured portions of the incident, showing Danny's aggressive approach to William's bench and his deliberate destruction of Margaret's photograph. The footage also clearly showed William's attempts to de-escalate the situation through polite conversation before being forced to defend himself. The crowd of observers in the memorial gardens had grown throughout the day as word of the incident spread through social media and local news reports. Many visitors were veterans themselves, drawn to offer support to a fellow service member who had been victimized for simply trying to honor his wife's memory. Their presence created a powerful visual reminder of the community that rallied around those who had served their country with honor. Local members of parliament began arriving at the scene as the political implications of the incident became apparent. The attack on an elderly veteran at a war memorial represented exactly the kind of senseless violence that politicians across the political spectrum could unite in condemning. Several MPs made statements to the press emphasizing their commitment to protecting veterans and ensuring that those who served their country received the respect and security they deserved. The three attackers were formally arrested on charges of assault, harassment, criminal damage, and public disorder. Additional charges related to the location of their crimes and the victim's status as a military veteran were being considered by prosecutors who recognized the opportunity to send a strong message about society's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable and deserving citizens. William remained composed throughout the lengthy process of giving statements and providing evidence, though the emotional toll of reliving the attack on Margaret's memory was clearly difficult for him. D.I. Collins ensured that he received appropriate support and was allowed to rest when needed, recognizing that the day's events had been traumatic despite his stoic response to them. As evening approached, the investigation was nearing completion, but the consequences of the morning's events were just beginning to unf. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as 78-year-old William Thompson adjusted his military medals one last time. He had no idea that in less than 20 minutes, his quiet visit to pay respects would turn into a scene that would be replayed on news channels around the world. What started as three young men thinking they could intimidate an old soldier ended with the most swift and decisive justice anyone had ever witnessed outside Buckingham Palace. This is the true story of how respect, honor, and duty collided with ignorance and cruelty, and why sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. The events of that Tuesday morning would remind everyone watching that some lines should never be crossed, and that true strength often comes in the most humble packages. William Thompson had served his country for over 3 decades, but his greatest moment of service was yet to come.